Good morning, everyone. My name is Martisiute, and it's my honor and privilege to welcome Admiral Rob Bauer and his team to EPC's Thought Leadership Forum alongside Dr. Fabian Zuleeg. Admiral Rob Bauer is the 33rd chair of the Military Committee of NATO. As the military advisor to the Secretary General and the North Atlantic Council, Admiral Bauer is NATO's most senior military officer. On his left-hand side is Dr. Fabian Zuleeg, who is the Chief Executive of the EPC, with overall responsibility, including providing strategic direction, managing staff and resources, and representing the EPC. He's also EPC's Chief Economist. Ladies and gentlemen, after a brief pause, EPC is reviving Thought Leadership Forum with the objective to bring top decision makers for a frank and engaging conversation on some of the most complex challenges and opportunities facing Europe today. Europe's defense and security is one such topic. That is why this year we've launched the European Defense and Security Project, DefSecEU. Team DefSecEU aims to provide actionable analysis and practical solutions to building Europe's defense at industrial, financial and societal levels, exactly the areas that NATO is also working on. We do this by bringing the industry, the institutions, member states, experts together. For example, this Wednesday, we do have a closed-door roundtable on mobilizing personnel, talents and skills needed for the defense of Europe. A few housekeeping rules. We will kickstart the forum with a keynote speech by Admiral Bauer, followed by around 30-minute conversation between the Admiral and Fabian Zuleeg, with focus on Ukraine, preparedness, deterrence and defense, and the priorities of EU and NATO for the defense of Europe. We will then open the floor for questions. Without any further ado, I would like now to give the floor to Admiral Bauer for his keynote speech. Thank you.
Good morning, all. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to have been invited to such a pristine think tank for the European Union. So I assume it wasn't an obvious choice to ask a NATO military officer to speak at this forum. Interestingly, this is the second time this month that I'm addressing an EU-focused audience. I recently delivered the Princess Beatrix Lecture in Maastricht, which was organized by Studio Europe, an organization founded to promote the Maastricht Treaty. Needless to say, I was the odd one out. And that's not an uncommon feeling for me. Over the past 2.5 years, I've been going around boardrooms, finance conferences, and even philanthropic institutions in Europe and America to persuade people to think about two questions. One, is my company or organization ready for war? And two, what can my company or organization do to prevent war? Now, that last question might surprise some people, but if we can make sure that all crucial services and goods can be delivered no matter what, then that is a key part of our deterrence. Deterrence is much wider than the military alone. When it comes to great power competition, all instruments of power can and will be used. We're seeing that with the growing number of sabotage acts, and Europe has seen that with energy supply. We thought we had a deal with Gazprom, but we actually had a deal with Mr. Putin. And the same goes for Chinese-owned infrastructure and goods. We actually have a deal with Xi. 60% of all rare earth materials are produced in China, and 90% is processed in China. 90% of the chemical ingredients for sedatives, antibiotics, anti-inflammatories, and low blood pressure medicines come from China. We are naive if we think the Communist Party will never use that power. Business leaders in Europe and America need to realize that the commercial decisions they make have strategic consequences for the security of their nation. Businesses need to be prepared for a wartime scenario and adjust their production and distribution lines accordingly. Because while it may be the military who wins battles, it's the economies that win wars. And that brings me to a key issue I want to discuss with you today: defense production capacity. Last weekend, I was at the Halifax Security Conference in Canada, where I spoke with a bipartisan US congressional delegation. And the topic was, of course, burden sharing. Now, although I object to the term burden, because security is not a burden, it is a responsibility, it is not a cost, it is an investment. I explained that the new capability targets that flow from the new NATO defense plans will lead to more even distribution of capabilities. European nations and Canada will develop capabilities that now only the United States has. And this is a result of a process that has been going on for years, so it is independent from any national election. It is a system based on military logic in order to have as much flexibility as possible. And it will allow Europe to have more operational autonomy in the event that the United States needs to reprioritize due to developments in the Indo-Pacific. Note how I said operational autonomy and not strategic, because strategically, Europe and North America are and will always be dependent on each other. What we are doing on the military side is making sure that capabilities are more evenly dispersed. This is all part of NATO's complete overhaul towards collective defense, which has caused the difference between NATO and national to fade more and more to the background. It is truly astonishing what we have achieved on the military and the political level. But as impressive as this is, the only way it can actually make people safer is if our defense production capacity grows exponentially. The Allied Chiefs of Defense gather in the Military Committee and discuss our deterrence and defense. We conclude that our readiness is higher than it has ever been. Thanks to our new defense plans, we now know exactly how we will defend key and relevant places in our alliance against the two threats described in the strategic concept and the NATO military strategy, being Russia and the terrorist groups. We also know precisely what assets or capabilities are required of us in a crisis scenario, including where and what to deploy and what their tasks would be. And we know, for at least 2 years already, that the investments necessary to make our new plans executable will be higher than 2%. Right now, we see that it varies per nation and how much more than 2% they need to spend. But let's say that the overall percentage that is necessary to make the new plans executable is much closer to 3% of GDP than it is to 2%. I expect that under the new Trump administration, there will be a much more intense discussion about how much more Europe and Canada need to spend. And that is a healthy and valid discussion to be had. But our discussions need to focus on something else as well. Because the bottom line is, of course, it is not about how much you spend, but how much you buy. We can talk endlessly about expenditure percentages, but meanwhile, prices are going up and delivery times go to the right. We're paying more for the same, sometimes even more for less. And that means our extra investments are not actually making us safer. And this is the result of a shortage of production capacity. It is the result of decades where especially European industries made sure they produced just enough, just in time. And European governments intended to spend as little as possible by buying the cheapest products. But as we have seen in a pandemic, not everything is plannable. We need to be able to support peak demand. Stocks save lives. This is especially true in the field of defense, where large stocks like spare parts and ammunition equal strong deterrence. Both governments and defense industries need to move away from the singular focus on efficiency to a more holistic focus on effectiveness and a more strategic approach to dependencies. That is why I find it baffling that there are still institutions and organizations who believe that investing in the defense industry somehow goes against the environmental, social, and governance criteria, also known as the sustainability goals. I can think of nothing more sustainable than preventing war. And I can think of nothing more unsustainable than being at war. A few weeks ago, former Finnish President Niinistö presented the report on resilience to the European Commission, where he proposes that the European Investment Bank expands funding possibilities for the defense sector beyond dual use. Because even though this bank has recently agreed to an expanded definition of dual use, it still has constraints with regard to the direct funding of defense products. From a military perspective, the Niinistö proposal would be an important step forward. I'm aware that any real change in the EIB policy will have to come from the EU ministers of finance. So I hope that they talk to their colleagues from the ministries of defense. And I advocate that both EU and NATO leaders also talk to the ratings agencies about the fact that an investment in defense has a negative impact on your credit rating. It should be the other way around. Investing in defense should be treated the same as investing in measures that limit climate change. The EU, with all its economic instruments, has a crucial role to play here. And it has played a positive role when it comes to defense production capacity. But I'm deeply concerned about the protectionist tendencies that are creeping into every proposal. Europe cannot, on the one hand, say to the US, UK, Norway, and Turkey that they fully count on their protection if they are ever attacked, and at the same time say, but we will not buy your products no matter how low our stocks are and no matter how depleted our own industry is. The same goes for the United States, who are letting the FMS hinder deliveries to Europe. There is more than enough demand for weapons and ammunition to go around, and that demand will only get higher. There's an immense amount of money to be earned, and the stakes couldn't possibly be higher, because our whole ability to keep ourselves safe and at the same time ramp up our support to Ukraine depends on the capacity of our industries. Neither side of the Atlantic should give in to protectionist tendencies. As former Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has said, protectionism does not protect us. It slows us down. And for anyone that thinks that we do not have it within ourselves to ramp this up, I say, look at Ukraine. In 2023, Ukraine had a $3 billion defense industry. In 2025, this will grow to 25 billion. 10 to 15 billion will be bought by the Ukrainian government. Approximately 2.5 billion is already pledged by a number of governments. So that still leaves a $7.5 to $12.5 billion window for investments in Ukraine. They are fast, they are good, and they are reliable. And investing in the Ukrainian defense industry has a synergetic effect. We help ourselves, we help them, and thereby we help ourselves again. So every dollar or euro you spend in Ukraine you earn back threefold. Ladies and gentlemen, to summarize, NATO's focus in the coming years will be on implementing our defense plans, creating a more even distribution of capabilities, increasing our investments, deepening our cooperation with partners, including the EU, and it is very much also about the realization that security is not something we can outsource to the military. War is a whole of society event, and therefore the prevention of war should also be a whole of society event. Over the past years, more and more people in Europe have come to realize that war can happen to them too. Again, in September this year, a poll by Eurobarometer stated that 58% of the respondents did not consider themselves well prepared for a crisis in the area where they live. And almost 2/3 feel that they need more information to prepare for disasters and emergencies. People want to do more. They understand that the world is an increasingly unsafe place, but they need leaders to help guide them through this. It takes leadership to explain the tough choices. That if you ramp up your deterrence and if you ramp up support to Ukraine, there will be less money to spend on other things. It will take away some of our luxuries. It will require sacrifice. And it will mean we will have to take risks. But not taking risks is the biggest risk of all. Both NATO and the EU have made the impossible possible. Decades of stability and prosperity. In this increasingly dark world, that is something to be immensely proud of. And it is something we can all be inspired by. The fact that the global security climate is becoming ever more complex and volatile does not mean we should slip into lethargic pessimism and think that these circumstances are beyond our control. We may not be able to change the world around us, but we can definitely change our place in it. One of the most commonly asked questions I get is, when will the Russians attack us? And my answer is that to a certain degree, that depends on us. Deterrence is the 7 feet tall bouncer in front of the nightclub that makes you think twice about going in without paying. So if we make sure that we are 7 feet tall, we are in a much better position. And that requires a resilient mindset. It requires that we constantly expect the unexpected. We need only to look at Ukraine to see what resilience can lead to. Over the past almost more than 1,000 days, the Russian leadership, together with other autocratic leaders around the world, have been shocked by the strength and resilience of the Ukrainian people. And they have been shocked by the united response from NATO, the EU, and other democratic nations around the world. Together we can, and we will prove that democracy will triumph over tyranny, that freedom will triumph over oppression, and that light will triumph over darkness. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral Bauer, for this eloquent speech that's highlighted a lot of hope, but also some of the core questions facing Europe's defense security today, and on which we will dwell right now as well. I would like to start the conversation with Ukraine. Now, the greatest threat that NATO allies and Europe is facing is Russia and its growing aggressive partnership with North Korea, China, Iran. And that fundamentally manifests in the war in Europe and Ukraine, but also through hybrid attacks on NATO's and EU's infrastructures. Admiral Bauer, how come that after, what you've said, more than now 1,000 days of Russia's full-scale invasion and around 4,000 days since annexation of Crimea, we're still far away from breakthrough victory in Ukraine. What are we waiting for?
But the Ukrainians don't lack the courage. Ukrainians don't lack the will. The Ukrainians lack the weapons and the ammunition and the other capabilities. And that's where they need us. So they only need our help. And I think we have done an amazing thing. If you look at 2.5 years of, and it's not only NATO, by the way, it's 50 nations in the world have supplied Ukraine with financial help, non-lethal help, and lethal help. So that in itself is an amazing thing. But it also shows again that a lot of people think wars can be planned, and strategists have talked about the short war. We will have a short war, as if we can plan that, because you also have an enemy. And if the enemy is willing to prolong the war because they think they can outsuffer and outlast us, then you have a problem. And we are now at the point where the short war is no longer a short war. We're approaching the start of year 3. And therefore, we need to be able to continue to support Ukraine. So I think when it comes to Ukraine, we have helped enormously together with the 50 nations that are doing that. But at the same time, the delivery time and the decision time sometimes we took before we gave those weapons were relatively long, and that not necessarily has helped Ukraine. So, but then again, war is something that is not as plannable as people think, because you're looking at 2 nations with a lot of smart people and a lot of opportunities, and they both try to come up with a plan that is better than the plan of your adversary. And then every time when there is a confrontation, you see whether that will be a success or not. So despite the Russian advances now at the moment, where now people sort of start to say that Ukraine is lost, but the front is not collapsing. They are giving in. At the same time, they're still in Kursk. Ukraine took back 50% of what the Russians originally took in the summer of 2022. There's more than 400,000 Russian soldiers wounded and killed. There is 1.3 young intelligent Russians left Russia. A lot of companies left Russia. If your best friend in the world is North Korea, you're not in a good place, I think. But the fact that North Korea has joined the war is an amazing and a shocking thing, because it means now there is a third nation in the war. And now the Indo-Pacific and Europe are connected through this war. Indo-Pacific is not far away now, because North Korea is in the war in Ukraine. So if people think it's a far away thing, actually the problem has increased as a result of what Russia allowed and China allowed North Korea to do.
Is indeed nuclear capable country. So it's a second nuclear capable country that is involved in this war. Thank you for sharing your thoughts about, how potentially Russia could be defeated. Fabian, the defeat of Russia in Ukraine is just the first step. Now, in parallel, we need to talk about ways of building lasting, sustainable, and just peace in Ukraine. EPC is doing tremendous work on Ukraine, and you've just come back from India yourself last week, where you discussed with your Indian colleagues possible ways of moving towards just and sustainable peace. Could you share your insights from that trip, but also in general, the many trips within the global south that you're conducting with Ukraine in mind, and if you could react to what Admiral Bauer has said? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Admiral, for that great introductory statement. I have to say, I think I'm more worried than that more optimistic picture, because I think what we've seen over the last 1,000 days is, yes, an amazing resilience by Ukrainians, but we've also seen a global environment which is getting more difficult. And we have seen also within the broad alliance of support, we've seen more fragmentation, more polarization, also globally. And that's also a reflection on these trips we've had all over the global south. And I would highlight two issues, and it would be great to get your response on that. One is that clearly the other conflict close to Europe's borders in the Middle East is having a tremendous impact on the global debate. And there are accusations of hypocrisy, accusations of double standards. So there's that comparison made between what is happening in Gaza and Ukraine. And the other issue, which is raised very often, is, and I'm not saying that I agree with it, but it would be good to hear your response to that, is that ultimately the cause of this war was NATO expansion, was the idea that Russia had a legitimate security interest, which was violated by the West. I'm not saying that is true. I'm saying that is a very dominant narrative, which you're hearing. So it would be good to hear your response.
Let's get those two things out of the way. I'm getting warmed up now. That's good. Okay, let's start with the second narrative. NATO is to be blamed for the war in Ukraine. It's the biggest nonsense ever, honestly, and people have to stop, continuing that narrative as a rightfully caused. There is a very good interview of Gorbachev with a Western German television, and it's in the 90s, and you can look it back on YouTube. And he's been asked this question: Was there a deal? Was there a deal between NATO and the Soviet Union or Russia to not expand, to not have members from the former Soviet Union nations into NATO? His answer was very simple: no, there wasn't. That's one. So this whole thing about a deal and that we broke the deal is not true. They asked the leader of the time, and there was no deal. That's one. Second, we haven't expanded to the east. We haven't. Nations east of us chose by themselves, out of their free will, as nations should be able to do, to join NATO. That's quite a difference, because it is portrayed as if, and of course then it is the United States in particular, but that we forced those nations to join us. That's not the case. They, out of their free will, could have done different things. They could have remained neutral. They could have joined another club. They could go back to Russia after the Soviet Union. But all of the nations that joined didn't want that. They wanted to join NATO. So NATO didn't expand to the east. Nations joined freely. And that is in accordance with the international rules-based order, that nations have the freedom to choose their own future and their own alliances. Now, thirdly, we are a defensive alliance. The Russians know we are not going to attack Russia. If we were really a threat to the Russians, they would have responded completely different to the accession of Finland, where they gained a border of 900 miles with NATO. They didn't move one soldier to the border with Finland. So the story that we are a threat to them is not true. He needs that narrative. Putin needs that narrative for his own audience, but he knows it's not true. So that is on the second point you brought up. Now, Israel, Gaza, and Hamas versus Ukraine and Russia. People, if you think it's the same, that's not true either. Russia attacked a sovereign state. And that's why all of us are supporting Ukraine. In accordance with the UN Charter, we can supply Ukraine with weapons and capabilities, to allow them to defend themselves. That is in accordance with the rules. Now, Israel didn't start the attacks in Gaza as the Russians did in Ukraine. Israel responded after the attacks of Hamas on the 7th of October. That is quite a different situation. So if you compare the two, then you shouldn't say as if Israel is Russia. It's not true. It's not true. And the discussion on double standards is all the nations, all the allies. I mean, NATO is not a part of this discussion formally. So, but the nations, the allies, are talking to Israel, and they talk to Israel about abiding to the rules. So there is no double standards there. There's no double standards in the fact that there is pressure from nations, from allies on Israel to stay within the rules. And I'm not saying Israel is doing everything right, but what I miss in the discussions is that I only hear about how terrible Israel is. I hear nothing about Hamas. Hamas conducted these attacks the way they did on purpose to push the Israelis over the edge. That's why they did it the way they did it, by rape, burning, hostages, everything. Now, Hamas is endangering its own people by hiding amongst them with military installations, rockets, headquarters. And by doing that, those targets become a legitimate military target in accordance with the law of armed conflict. And it's not good that there's a lot of civilian casualties, don't get me wrong. But to attack Hamas in these circumstances is possible in accordance with the law of armed conflict. The discussion to be had then is how much force do you use to get to your objective? You can go in with soldiers in all these tunnels and try to kill Hamas one by one with a bayonet, which is very dangerous for the Israeli soldiers, or you throw a big bomb on it. Now, they chose so far to very often throw a big bomb on it. And we can have a discussion on that, whether that is outside the proportion. But that's something else than all the things I hear. And I don't hear anything about Hamas. And I think that's not good. So I would like to see a more balanced discussion there as well.
Thank you, Admiral. Coming back to Ukraine and EU, NATO in particular. Admiral, I would like to ask you, given the uncertainty, we know Trump's intentions, we don't know what will be his actions. Now, what is absolutely critical for Ukraine's is security guarantees. Now, NATO summits have so far been inconclusive about this, which raises a question as to what are alternate ways to have Article 5-like guarantees, and I'm not talking about memorandums, agreements, or arrangements, guarantees in the spirit of defense treaties. And can Europe do that alone without US participation? Thank you.
It's fascinating that if there's no conclusions by the summits, which is the heads of state and government, that you expect the chair of the military committee to come up with the answer. But so there's a number of things I will say about this. One, I don't know what the plan will be from the second Trump administration. I think we have to wait until we actually know who the players are in terms of the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and the National Security Advisor. And that's still not a done deal because there's still hearings and there's still movement in the candidates, etc. So we have to wait until we know the players, and then we need to know from them and hear from them what their plan is. That's one. And otherwise, it becomes one big guessing game, which and we can go into 20 scenarios, but I don't think that is wise. Second, I cannot imagine that it is in the interest of the United States to allow Putin to come out of those possible negotiations as a winner. I cannot imagine that is in the interest of the United States. especially now with North Korea having joined the conflict, because that actually means that, and we know the first weapon systems from North Korea have now from Russia have now been seen in North Korea. So the payback from the Russians, of course, is money, real weapon systems, technology, maybe ballistic missiles, in ballistic missile technology, space, nuclear even. We don't know. But the first hardcore weapon systems are already being spotted in North Korea. So that means that for the United States, what happens in Ukraine and between Ukraine and Russia in terms of these negotiations is now also connected to the security situation on the Korean Peninsula. Because what is happening there is also a threat to the United States with its troops there. So therefore, it is much more than just Russia and Ukraine. It's now also North Korea and indirectly also China, because China keeps Russia in the fight. They're not providing weapon systems per se, but they provide Russia with everything to make weapon systems. And therefore, they basically keep the Russians in the fight. So I think if people think it's just negotiations about Russia and Ukraine, it now has become a much wider discussion and a much wider package that needs to be to be looked at. So it has not become easier for the new administration, I would say, because North Korea has joined the war. And so therefore, I'm not gonna guess on what it will be. The last thing I will say is there were security guarantees for Ukraine in 1994 when they gave away their nuclear weapons. Those parties were US, UK, and surprisingly, Russia. So one of the parties that was supposed to provide security for Ukraine invaded Ukraine in 2014, as you said, for the first time, and the full-fledged invasion in 2022. So for Ukraine, I would guess the security guarantees in as part of peace negotiations is a very, very important part, because you can have a stop of the conflict, but if you're not if you can't be convinced, or if you're not convinced that it will not start again very soon, then why should you stop the war? So I think those are the elements that are probably part of this discussion.
And Fabian, you recently said in your publication that when it comes to the outcome of the US elections, it's a watershed, yet another watershed moment for Europe, and what it requires is for Europe to be brutally honest in its assessment as to where Europe stands. Just building on what Admiral Bauer said, and also picking on his speech, whereby Europe has to muster this political, military, financial, industrial capabilities and political leadership. What's that brutal assessment in that regard for you? Thank you.
I think firstly, what has to be clearly faced is that we have not done enough, and that we are in a situation where the situation on the ground could be better. It could have been in many ways a more favorable balance for Ukraine. I'm not sure that we could have achieved a peace which would have regained all the territory for Ukraine, but certainly we could have done more, and we didn't. And I fear that maybe I'm not quite as optimistic about the next Trump administration, because I think the temptation is going to be to make some form of ceasefire deal. I'm not talking about a peace deal, because a just and lasting peace would have to look very different in any case. but that politically the temptation is going to be great for Trump to show that he can stop the killing. And I think then we are facing a very difficult choice in Europe, because we would then have to, at least from my perspective, we would have to prepare much more for future aggression. We would have to invest even more. But where I fear that this is going to fall down is in terms of the readiness in our societies. And it's also the big difference between different parts of Europe. Clearly, there are some countries which, in most cases, have a border with Russia, who feel the threat very directly. But the debate in many other countries is about how do we stop this war? How can we actually stop the cost of this to us? And I appreciate the comments you made, Admiral, about that this is not really a cost. But in the debate in many countries, that's the way it is seen. And we have seen also that in many countries, we are now seeing a rise in political support for parties who are not supporting Ukraine, who are not wanting to continue this process. So we have to also deal with the political fragmentation which we've seen in Europe. And last but not least, we also have countries within Europe who are not on the side of confronting this threat. So I think this is going to be a much more testing period. I think in the first instances, it was very much a reaction. It was the right reaction. We did more than we ever thought we would do. But how do we translate that into the long haul? How do we actually make sure that we sustain it? And how do we also, and that was already mentioned, but how do we actually change our economies? Because our economies at the moment are not ready for this kind of long-term confrontation. They are not ready in terms of production, but we are also not ready in terms of economic security. This is much more difficult in many ways than military security because it's directly interwoven with the fabric of our economies. So there's a big task, and I'm not sure we have the continuing political will to carry it through.
Can I respond? Let me start first by saying, fear cannot be a strategy. So for me, I agree with you, it's going to be difficult and it's going to be a challenge. But my point, what I tried to make, is that we need more leadership and that we need to talk about the difficult discussion points, and that that we have to make people understand that even if we stop the war in Ukraine tomorrow under whatever circumstances, it doesn't mean we will go back to normal, because this is part of a much larger challenge, and that is the rebalancing of power between the US and China. That is what is happening in the world. And Ukraine war is one example where Putin thought he would get away with it because of a perceived vacuum in what happened in 2008 in Georgia, what happened in Crimea in 2014, no response from the Western world. Syria, no real response from the Western world. So he thought he would get away with it. That it was another fait accompli. And he thought he would be able to do it in 5 days, and that we would not respond. Now, things have gone differently. I think Putin has lost strategically because he hasn't achieved any of his strategic goals. He was after a regime change and basically a puppet state, and therefore the buffer he wants. Now, he hasn't achieved any of that. At the same time, people have to understand everything that is going on now is about much more than Ukraine. This is about the whole set of rules and agreements that we have in the world, the rules-based international order. And if we allow Russia to win in Ukraine, then autocratic leaders in the world will see that you can break the rules and you can actually benefit from breaking the rules. And that is bad. That's bad for all of us. And so there is something at stake that is much larger. I mean, fighting for Ukraine in itself is important enough, don't get me wrong. But this is a fight about something much bigger. And we have neglected maintenance to our own system, to democracy. And basically, we thought it's such a good system, it doesn't need any maintenance. And I think we made a mistake. And therefore, we haven't paid attention that there is now an alternative for a number of nations in the world. Because if we show up and say, you know, we have a great system, shall I teach you how it works? People will look at you and say, what do you mean, teach us how it works? Look at yourself. By the way, I don't want your money anymore, because you always wanted to see my prison. You wanted to talk about UN Security Council 1325, and you had a controller with you, which had and I had to prove how I spent every cent. I now get money from Russia and China, and it's much easier. Although we now also hear the first complaints from a number of nations about the Russians and the Chinese, which we should think about and exploit in a way. But I mean, the good thing for NATO is there is a leader, and that is the United States. And I think in Europe, that is much more difficult. There is not one leader. And therefore, there is this constant discussion going on where to go. And I think that makes the life in EU much more difficult, because it's always a discussion. It's always a discussion. And therefore, and by the way, it's also on a much wider range of topics than security. But that's also true, of course. But I think if we do not understand that we need to become more resilient, that there's more at stake than just Ukraine, then, and that's what I'm trying to do, and other people try to do as well. Pistorius, the Minister of Defense in Germany, had a very important point. During a dinner, he said, if I go to the eastern part of Germany, where is that the AfD? Is that the party? And the AfD is very popular, and they are not in favor of supporting Ukraine, etc. He says, if I go to a room with 300 of AfD supporters, I can convince 90% of them that it is important to continue to support Ukraine. But it means hard work. It means, if you look at all the people in Germany or that live in the eastern part of it or that support AfD, then it's a lot of meetings times 300. So it is hard work. It is an investment in our ideals, in our way of life. We have to work harder for it. And it means not following TikTok and looking for likes. It means explaining to people why things are important, and why we try to convince people why it is important. Don't think and don't only look at what people like, because we have gone past that point, I think.
It's almost time for questions, but there's one question I would still like to ask. Admiral, Andris Kubilius, during his parliament hearing, said that, you know, Russia can produce in 6 months what Germany has in its stocks. And NATO has come a long way in bolstering defense and deterrence posture. We have new force model, new force structure, regional defense plans, DDA, some of the largest exercises with Steadfast Defender. Do we have the forces and the equipment and the capabilities and societal readiness in case there is an attack in Europe and NATO?
The answer is yes. We have the forces. We have the readiness. Our challenge at the moment is that we know there's a number of things that we need to buy more of, stocks, especially because we gave away a lot of our capabilities and ammunition from our own operational stocks, from our own, let's say, operational capabilities. So they need to be replaced. So we know that. But we need to invest more in air defense, for example, but also deep precision strike, which is a discussion that is relatively young in NATO. And I'm very happy that we had it and that we have now changed this attitude from, I mean, the idea was we're a defensive alliance, so we will only sit and wait until we're attacked. And then when we're attacked, we will be able to shoot down the arrows that come to us. But it's smarter not only to do that, but also to attack the archer that is in Russia if Russia attacks us. So you need to have a combination of deep precision strike with which you can take out the weapon systems that are used to attack us. And of course, because we're a defensive alliance, we will have to take the first blow. So Russia will start the conflict because we are not going to attack Russia out of nothing. Yeah, we will need more air defense. That's one of the lessons from Ukraine. And at the same time, we are going to invest in the deep precision strike. Now, there's a number of things we need to do more and better to become better. But we also have to understand that all the regional plans are based on the Russian threat of 24 February 2022. That is where our plans have been based upon. Now, the Russian armed forces, land forces are bigger than in February 2022. That is concerning. But at the same time, the quality of those forces has gone down. So it's older equipment and it is less trained soldiers. So at the moment, the Russians are not the same threat as in February 2022. So we have a bit of time. We have a bit of time to prepare ourselves, but we need that time because our industry is building up too slow. To the point of view of what Fabian said, we need to ramp up the investments in the defense industry in order to become readier ourselves and to continue to support Ukraine.
Thank you, Admiral Bauer, and thank you, Fabian. I would like now to open the floor for questions. And Romil, I turn to you. Perhaps you could approach the people who would like a question. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Anastasia. I'm the Ukrainian human trainee in the European Parliament. Thank you so much for such a brilliant exchange. I've got two questions for you, Admiral Bauer. The first one is going to touch upon the strategy that NATO pursues towards Ukraine and helping us defeat Russia. We are very grateful for all the support we are receiving for the time being. Yet, given that the Russian imperialism is still making significant inroads across both Ukraine and our partners, it seems that Ukraine keeps receiving enough weapons not to lose, but not enough to win. Do you see any changes coming in this regard? And my second question is going to touch upon the line from your brilliant speech, particularly the one that deals with NATO's readiness to prevent Russia's aggression against their allies. You mentioned that it depends to what extent you're going to allow Russia sort of like cross this line. And as a Ukrainian, I spent my summer in Ukraine in a very small town very close to the Romanian border. And I was observing a lot of drones that were launched by Russia. They encroached the Moldovan airspace, and also back in time, adding to this, our military reported that occasionally missiles were encroaching the Romanian airspace. So basically, Russia keeps using NATO airspace to line up new trajectories. And I'm just wondering, if this line is not right enough, which one would be? Thank you.
Okay. The challenge, I think, is that all the nations that support Ukraine, the 50 nations that support Ukraine, basically all say we will support Ukraine for as long as it lasts. But that in itself is not a strategy. And so that is indeed one of the things that is not entirely clear when it comes to what are we working towards, other than the great things we have done and the enormous support that Ukraine has received in terms of money and weapons and ammunition so far. I mean, it's not nothing. It's not a small thing. But in order to have the discussion with our own people on why is it important and why do we need to continue to do this, you need to have that higher discussion as well amongst the leaders, amongst the political leadership. And I think there is a growing understanding that is necessary. But as you say, that is not advocated until now. So I think that is something we might have to do more on. But it also depends, of course, on what happens in the next couple of months in terms of whether or not there will be peace negotiations or not. So it's not an entirely probably satisfying answer, but I agree with you that there is not that much clarity on what all of us together want to achieve in Ukraine with regard to winning, losing, etc. Your second point on Romania and the red lines. The investigations we have done on the incursions in the Romanian airspace and in the Polish airspace, by the way, have indicated so far that 9 out of 10, about 90% of them, is not intentional. They are, if you know where they operate with their drones, is the Danube River, which is the border between Ukraine and Romania. And in that area, for all sorts of reasons, those drones get out of their trajectory. For example, because there is jamming because of the EW and the electronic warfare environment. And so some of them get into Romania and then are downed. Many of them are not even having weapons, so it is drones with only, let's say, sensors on board. There are some incursions, and one is, for example, in Poland, where a cruise missile went in, turned around, and because that's the thing with cruise missiles, you can direct them. It's not a ballistic trajectory. They went into Poland, turned around, and approached Lviv from the west, which is dangerous because most of the air defense systems in Lviv look, of course, to the east, because that's where the threat most of the time come from. So there are some examples of intentional Russian behavior, but the majority is still unintentional. That is so. And I see now we have increased the number of fighter aircraft in Romania and in Poland. We have put systems into place to make sure we detect those weapons or drones timely, and then respond with the aircraft that nations themselves and NATO, NATO nations have now in Romania and Poland, for example.
More question?
Paul Taylor, Senior Fellow here at the EPC. Admiral, thank you for your presentation. You talked a lot about the industrial production that we need, about the financial resources that we need. What about the human resources? Do you have enough soldiers, technicians, people with the technological skills for both the military and the armed forces? If not, what do we need to do about that? Do we need conscription? What can we do to recruit perhaps more women into the armed forces and into cybersecurity and the defense industries? How do you see that as part of our whole of society readiness that you're calling for?
Thank you. Let me start by saying I don't have any soldiers. NATO doesn't have soldiers. The soldiers belong to the nations and the armed forces of the nations. So this is a discussion that indeed we have, but the decisions on that is always a national decision in the 32 nations of the alliance. I very often hear this intriguing argument that demographically it's impossible to grow the armed forces, and that is nonsense. The European population is bigger now than in the Second World War, and there were pretty big armies then. So it is a question of prioritization. That's one. Second, I know a lot of people, at least in my country, in the Netherlands, part-time working is, we are the champion part-time workers in the Netherlands, men and women. And that is great. That is great. So everybody can combine work and children and all the things that are important in life. However, and that is a little bit of discussion on the scale from me to we. I think we have gone completely to the me. It's my right. It's my happiness. It's my privacy. It's my right to work part-time. Okay, good. Now, and they have done some research on that. There's problems in healthcare industry. If people in the healthcare industry would work 5% more, then the problem in the healthcare would be solved. So I think people very often think that someone else will solve the problem. But if all of us want more security, all of you look at the guys and girls in uniform to solve that problem for you. But if you want more security, you need to become part of the solution. And that is the discussion on, and I will never say to a nation, this is how you have to solve it. But you have to have a system in place to increase the number of soldiers in your nation. Because if you have a professional armed forces, which is the case in most of the nations, and the war starts, after 3 days, there's a lot of soldiers wounded and killed. And the chance that people then voluntarily say, hey, I would like to come, there will be, by the way, there's now, I read a research, a polling that in the Netherlands now there is a majority, more than 50% of the people are willing to die for their country, which 2 years ago was like 5% or something. So that's fascinating. And so people start to understand that they are actually part of the solution, if you say that. And so now the governments need to make sure that what the people understand is translated into policies and that we are going to organize ourselves. And it can be conscription, it can be partial conscription, it can be reservists or conscription and reservists, or people from the professional armed forces that leave become automatically a reservist, which is not always the case. That requires most time changes in law, etc. So I'm not going to tell the nations how they should do it, but they should have a system in place. To give an example, in Finland, the professional armed forces are about 8,000, 22,000 conscripts every year. So the standing armed forces is 30,000 in a nation of 5.5 million. In a month time, they can call in 280,000 reservists. 280,000. They have the uniforms, they have the weapons, the helmets, everything, the boots, everything for those 280,000. So they can ramp up from 30 to 280,000 in 30 days. And then they can ramp up to 950,000, which is in total 1/5 of their population. Now, they have that system because they had to look after themselves for 80 years. But we thought someone else was looking after us for 80 years. And I think we have to stop doing that. And therefore, I think it is right that the United States expect European nations and Canada to do more. Because the treaty talks about Article 3, which is every nation needs to be able to defend themselves. And literally, a number of years ago, people would say, of course we can't, of course we cannot do it, but we have NATO. Yeah, but NATO is us, it's not someone else. If all of us are able to defend ourselves, then Article 5 actually becomes much more easy. So all these things that someone else will solve your problem is strange. It is your security. It is our security. It is our way of life. So if we want to keep that, we need to be able to do something. And it is not someone from Mars who will come to save us. It is us, ourselves. So to your point, sir, whether it is conscription, whether it is mobilization, whether it is reservists, or a combination of all, is up to the nation. But I urge the nations and the governments to come up and think about that system.
Thank you, Admiral Bauer. It's 6 minutes past 12. There's still quite a few hands. Would you have a moment for another question, or shall we go? Thank you. Just one more, Romil.
Yeah, sorry. Hello, my name is Romil. I'm working also in the EPC. Would be wonderful if we could fit two questions. I just have a question regarding, as Martisiute stated, Ukraine is on irreversible path to NATO. So my question is about the NATO's openness to expertise from Ukraine, as a lot of people say Ukraine can bring specialists to speed up the alliance's innovation. And my question is, how open is NATO to integrating Ukrainian professionals into its structures, particularly within EU-based roles before the full membership?
Do you want to answer that first? Okay, sweet. My question comes back more to being prepared and prevention. And it actually touches more on military and civil structures. For the moment, I still think in the EU, when it comes to crises, it's still very ad hoc between the military and the civil structures. So it needs to be more formal. So my question to you is, how can we actually ensure, if we come back to Sauli Niinisto and his idea of a preparedness union, a whole of society approach, how can we actually ensure that the military and the civil structures talk and they're more effective in times of crises? Because I really think for the moment, it's not that well coordinated. And if we really want to be prepared, then this is something that we need to work more on.
I'm not entirely sure whether I fully understood your suggestion of having Ukrainians in NATO to have an EU discussion on EU subjects or something.
It's mostly about how Ukrainian expertise can help alliance right now without the full membership.
Now, we have taken a decision in Washington, and that is the JTEC, and it stands for the Joint Analysis and Training Center that is now going to be stood up in Poland, in Bydgoszcz. And it will be a combined NATO and Ukraine center where we will talk about the lessons learned of the war in Ukraine, which is very important. However, we also have to be careful at the same time to think, all of us, that what happens in Ukraine will be the same when NATO will fight the Russians. Because there is differences. The war in Ukraine primarily is a land battle. It's not really a joint fight. There is some aircraft, but it's primarily a land battle. There's not a maritime war going on, although it's fascinating that Ukraine, without a navy, has taken out so many Russian assets in the Black Sea with drones. So the drones lesson is an important discussion to be had, but will it be applicable in the Atlantic Ocean, in the Indian Ocean, far away from land? Question mark. I'm not saying I know on all these things the answers, but it is good to have these discussions. So yes, we will capture the lessons of Ukraine in that war. There is a tremendous amount of innovation going on between the small and medium-sized companies from the West very often, but also in Ukraine. Basically, everybody is making drones at the moment, probably illegally before vodka, but now everybody's making drones. So that is great. And so there's a lot of things going on. As I said, the industry is ramping up very, very fast. And that's what you see in a country at war. Same in Israel. If something is invented tonight, they will use it tomorrow morning if they think it's beneficial. And they don't wait for the committee and all the approvals and the regulations and all what we do. So that is ongoing, and I think we will capture those lessons. To your point on the whole of society approach, I think we have stovepiped our societies. There was a stovepipe of economy, that was the EU. There was a stovepipe that was defense, that was NATO. There was a stovepipe for energy, a stovepipe for food, and all these stovepipes were on their own. And security is the cross-cutting theme, because we've seen that the Russians have used food, grain, energy as a weapon, migration as a weapon. And so the idea, I mean, we have thought about, there were two sort of guiding principles in foreign policy for the last 30, 40 years. If we are mutually economic dependent, you will never have war again. Well, that was proven wrong. And secondly, if we make the Chinese rich, they will become democratic. Well, that's proven wrong. But it has been big drivers in how we look at the world. And so we had a contract with Gazprom, at least that's what we thought. The fact that Putin said to Gazprom, close the valve, was not in the contract, but it happened. So we have become naive. We sold all the mines. We were only busy in getting rich, and nobody was thinking strategically about, hey, maybe we should have a number of those mines, because so to give you an example, if we want to save the planet and we want to get rid of fossil fuel, I'm not cynical about this, honestly. If you want to go from fossil to something else, that's what we all want, fine, good. Then we don't want, then nobody dares to go to nuclear energy, which I think is probably not the smartest thing to not do, but that's another debate. And then the third thing is renewable energy. Everybody's in favor of renewable energy, aren't we? I mean, it's great. Wind and solar, it's fantastic. Well, there's two questions. Is it enough to have the electricity that we all need for driving, cooking, the industry, the lighting, etc.? But let's assume that is possible. As I said, 90% is in the hands of the raw materials for renewable energy is in the hands of China. If she doesn't, I mean, the EU wants to go 2030, 2035. When are we gone? Oh, 35? Everybody is on renewable. 11 years from now. 11 years from now, in 2035, she does this. What does that mean for us here in this part of the world? When he wants something else from us, when he's annoyed by what we do, and then people say, yeah, but yeah, he has all the mines now. Now, Rand Corporation CEO said to me, the rare earth materials are actually not necessarily that rare. You can find them in Canada, in Sweden, in Finland, and Norway. But then we have to dig a mine. And that's also against the environment. And all these choices have consequences. That's my point. And if the focus is only on saving the planet, then we forget the raw reality of what the world is also thinking about. And so we have to become more realistic, and we have to become more willing to look at these things in a broader and a more strategic mindset.
Thank you, Admiral Bauer, also for your extra time. And I would like now to invite Fabian to conclude today's Thought Leadership Forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'll be brief, given that we are already over time, but it has been fascinating. I think it is the first time we've had a NATO military officer at the EPC. But I'm sure it's not the last time, because I think what this has very much illustrated is that we are living through watershed moments in European history, and that we are going to have to change how we approach, how we think about not just our economies, how we have to think about all of the trade-offs and the choices which we are now facing. It's maybe one area where I'm a little more skeptical is the impact of the Trump administration and what that might mean. And I would say with the approach of the EPC over the last years, we've always looked at worst case scenarios. And I think that's maybe in the world we're living at the moment, not a bad approach to looking ahead. If it turns out better, so much the better for us. I think what we've also heard is that much of this will depend on the economy. It will depend on how far we can adapt our economies to this new reality. And that, of course, also means there is a big role for the EU. There's a big role also for that strategic discussion around how do we finance this public good, which we are all relying on in our security. So thank you very much for this conversation. We are going to continue this focus on defense and security and the implications for economic security, for resilience in the EPC, and it would be great to also have you back at some point in future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.